Good afternoon. My name is Bruno Libaber, and I'm the Director General of CERRE, the independent think tank focusing on the regulation of network industries such as the digital, energy, and mobility sectors. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this live debate. Our topic today is Europe's digital sovereignty in the age of pandemics. And we'll obviously be talking about the digital sectors, but we'll also reflect about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on globalization, as well as on multilateralism. We'll talk about what that means for Europe and for Europe's digital sovereignty. And finally, we'll ask whether in this area, Europe has the means of its ambitions and what is needed to achieve these. Our conversation, and we're very happy about that, will feature two leading figures in EU and global policymaking. And I would like to welcome and thank both of them for joining us this afternoon. One is Margrethe Vestager, Executive Vice President of the European Commission in charge of a Europe fit for the digital age, as well as of competition. And the other is Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization, former European Commissioner for Trade, and currently, among many other positions, Honorary President of the Jacques Delors Institute and a member of the CERRE Board of Directors. This debate is live streamed on CERRE's YouTube channel, as well as on our website, the address of which appears behind me on the left of your screen. And finally, you have the possibility to put questions to a guest via Slido with the code CERRE Digital. So please don't hesitate to use that facility. We're looking forward to your questions. Executive Vice President Vestager, my first question will be for you. In the communication published by the Commission last February, and which was entitled Shaping Europe's Digital Future, there is a reference to technological sovereignty. So what do you have in mind when you talk of technological or digital sovereignty?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for doing this. I think it's an excellent time to have this discussion because we are, of course, still in a learning process, but we have already seen quite a lot what happens when we all go digital. And digital sovereignty is about being able to control what we're doing, not to do everything by ourselves, but to have sort of the final say about what is ongoing here in order to maintain sort of our regulatory sovereignty. Because we have seen how much the GDPR, our digital citizens' rights, how that has set the agenda all over the planet. And I think it's very important and reflects the fact that we have values that we want to put into real life. If we want to have a say on how to regulate artificial intelligence that may pose a risk to fundamental values, then we need to be able to do artificial intelligence. We need to know what it is that we're dealing with. Otherwise, we will not be able to regulate it in an efficient manner. So being able to do things is what is needed to be able to control things, not to be able to do the entire thing. And here a number of things will have to be considered. One of them, of course, is where do we get the inputs, the hardware needed? How can we make sure that also European businesses, they have a platform, so to speak, to make themselves strong also in a global marketplace?
Okay, thank you. So my understanding is that digital sovereignty involves overcoming dependency in data, dependency in digital assets. It also implies achieving cybersecurity and therefore security, and we'll probably talk about that. It involves enforcing privacy. But we knew all that. We knew all that before the COVID-19 pandemic. So now the world is very different from what it was less than 2 months ago, with a sanitary, an economic, a social, and not unlikely a political crisis of a global magnitude. So Pascal Lamy, how does this impact on this discussion of digital sovereignty?
Well, first, I think it's very risky to make any prediction on what the post-COVID world will look like. Whenever this post-COVID world will be born. And we know that the midwifing is extremely complex. Yet, I've been involved in many discussions in weeks about this on many continents, on Europe, US, China, and the rest. And I think the likelihood is that the world post-COVID will be a tougher world for us all. Because on top of the sort of normal competition between firms in a global capitalist system, we will have a substantial increase of competition between states. What does that mean for the digital? I think A, the world will move more digital, and B, the world will move more state-driven. More digital because the demand for digital services has been boosted by this crisis, because whereas there might be some shortening of value chains in manufacturers, there will be a lengthening in value chains in services, things about telemedicine, for instance, and this is digital. And third, because there are some virtues in the contactlessness of digital services. The states will come in big way, A, because they've had to do that during the crisis in unprecedented proportions, both financially and in maintaining public order and health systems, and they will also have to step in vigorously for the exit stimulus. And we see the orders of magnitude that, for instance, are discussed in the European Union. So all in all, a world which will be good for elephants, bad for rabbits. And the question is, where's the EU between rabbits and elephants? China and US clearly are elephants. Singapore or Rwanda or Chile are probably rabbits. Where are we in between? That's the big question for the European Union. And I think it makes it more urgent that this move, which existed pre-COVID, to sovereignty, to strategic autonomy, is increased. And we will see whether this time, like in previous time, this sort of crisis has convinced European public opinion that we need to move forward in further integrating the EU and in increasing digital sovereignty.
Okay, Margrethe, any reaction on what Pascal said? Do you share his analysis?
To some degree, yes, I do. Also with the caveat, as I said initially, that it's very, very difficult right now to say what will be the post-COVID-19 world. We were on this trajectory already, but of course, what we have experienced the last 2 months have accelerated to a very extreme degree, sort of the travel we were already on. And that, I think, is very important for us also then to react upon it. But the very tricky thing here is that it is as if we wake up as nationals, then over the day we learn that we can only be safe and sound and prosperous by working together. So we go to bed as Europeans, but then we wake up the next morning again as nationals and relearn over the day that we can only stay safe and prosperous by working together. So it's very important that we keep sort of maintaining this exchange of experience, that it is by working together, by being a stronger union, by being more assertive as Europeans, that we can play this role among the elephants. Because Europe has so much more to offer than what we present. If you look at industrial technology, if you look at industrial data, Europe has so much more to offer than what we currently make good of. It may be so that the social media, the platforms of that era and marketplaces, that these were not Europeans. But the next phase can be European if we assess ourselves as someone who wants to take that place. And I think that is very important, because if we do not have the ambition that we want to take that place, then it's a given that we'll not have it.
Okay. We're talking about dependency, and we talk about, and we may come back to that, to dependency, for instance, with regard to platforms, and we could also have referred to other issues which are related to some platform specific problematic behavior and practices, and which for a number of years have been keeping busy regulators and policymakers, not only in the EU after all, but also in many other parts of the world, including in the United States. But in most cases, and as it's often the case, that there are always two faces to a coin. And at least at CERRE, we try to make analysis which in fact rarely lead us to see things totally black or totally white. We are most often I would say, in the shaded parts. And when I look at what COVID-19 has highlighted in the recent weeks with regard to the online platform economy, a number of positive aspects which have taken the forms of contributions which are made by most of the large platforms in supporting the public authorities' efforts to manage the crisis. I'm just thinking of Netflix, which cut by 50% the available bandwidth to avoid network congestion after your colleague called Facebook, which is offering data mapping of areas where people are reporting COVID-19 symptoms. I could talk about the API set up by Apple and Google. I could talk about Microsoft, which just launched with UNICEF a digital learning platform to support children who are studying remotely. So basically, we see that there are those two faces to the coin. And my question is very concrete. Beyond those anecdotal elements, some people may say, although I'm not sure, but in any event, welcome initiatives. Could the crisis lead you to reconsider some of your plans regarding the contents of the future Digital Services Act by, for instance, putting less or more or a different emphasis on some specific aspects of the regulation of the large digital players?
No, because we may need what we have seen during this crisis, but of course we need it consistently. And consistency comes with regulation that is for everyone. And I think it is very important that we have obligations that are clear, but also that are enforceable and that are being enforced. If you, for instance, look at the debate about the country of origin principle, which is a very intense debate, that is understandable. Well, one of the problems here is that there are very few obligations to be enforced, and that the relationship between origin and destination country for the services, that relationship is not very good. There's not a trusted relationship here. So I think even though sort of initially you would think, oh, maybe platforms, they don't want regulation. If you want an unfragmented single market, well, then you need these things to work. And with obligations comes enforcement, and with enforcement comes, of course, authorities who can enforce and have the willingness to enforce if you do it on behalf of other people.
Okay. Pascal, the mix of positive and much less positive features of the big tech's role and impact on the economy and on our lives, do you think this should lead us to rethink what I would call the relationship, the types of relationships that need to be built between, on the one hand, those players who, by the way, are often providing the new public space, and on the other hand, public authorities in Europe? Micro, Pascal. Ton micro.
I very much agree with the substance of what Margrethe just said. And I would go even further in answering your question. At the beginning, the philosophy, the ideology of the promoters of these platforms were sort of libertarians.
Mm.
What they were preaching was that they, as individuals and private entities, would do better in creating public goods that people like, that increase welfare, that increase friendship, than public authorities. There are lots of speeches by many of them in this direction. What we see now is roughly the same people saying, hey, we need public regulation. The tensions, contradictions between freedom, security, price, availability, which public authorities have always been struggling with, because this necessitates a political decision between more freedom and less security, or more security and less freedom. These people cannot do that. And by the way, they now are recognizing they cannot do that. So I think, again, looking at this post-COVID world where states will be more powerful, more influent, I think there is a huge likelihood that this regulatory stepping in will increase in a context where I think this is now necessary, because if something will increase post-COVID, it's the level of precaution. And regulation is very often about precaution, and precaution is very often about regulation.
Okay. I'd like to come back to you, Margrethe Vestager. Your portfolio includes, as I mentioned earlier, both competition and what I would call an industrial policy for the digital sector. Let's put it that way. These are my words. You will correct me. But these are two areas which traditionally have been rather difficult to reconcile. So how do you nevertheless intend to do so? In particular, how do you plan securing EU digital sovereignty in the current global competitive landscape? How will you enable EU players to build up the necessary scale and efficiencies post-crisis, remove barriers, create flexibility for fast cooperation and consolidation?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to recall that we live in a social market economy, not in just a social economy or a socialist economy for that matter. It is a social market economy. So here, of course, the interplay between business, private funds, and sort of the legitimacy of our democracies to set the framework, I think that is what is very important. Because in order to achieve what we want to achieve, we need the competitive pressure in the marketplace to get the best innovation, the best solutions, the fastest rollout. There are a number of things that can be done in a regulatory manner to ensure this. And for me, sort of a modern industrial policy is a policy that addresses market failure. If you see the first important project of common European interest, that addresses microelectronics, be sensors of different kinds, low energy microelectronics. So at the same time, in our digital transition, we also serve green purposes. And that's an excellent example of member states and businesses coming together to address a European market failure. And that, I think, is a very, very good thing. And combined with a certain competitive pressure, a regulatory environment that is enhancing, an obvious example to that would be to build these data spaces, which is basically sort of the contractual framework to allow businesses and public authorities to exchange data in a secure way. We have preoccupying ourselves a lot with the privacy issues and personal data. There is so much more to say about data than this. And here we can provide for data spaces that allow businesses to make the most of the data available. So we can correct market failure. We can create sort of spaces where markets can be created. And of course, we can make sure that businesses, they remain innovative. And in doing that, that they also remain competitive.
Okay, we have, thank you. We have a number of viewers who are putting questions via Slido using the CERRE digital code. One of them is asking you, he's anonymous, and he's asking you, should European politicians pick industry winners and losers, given dual political calls to create EU champions and put limits on foreign tech giants? Madame Vestager.
Well, I'm afraid there is a risk that it will be very expensive for taxpayers if politicians are allowed to pick winners and losers. I think there is an unfortunate, very long history of spectacular failures in doing that. What our democracy can provide is a market and business environment that allows for customers and consumers to pick the winners and losers. And I think it's much better that hundreds and thousands, maybe millions of customers and consumers, that they pick who they think should win. But that doesn't leave politics unemployed, because you still need to frame this marketplace. For instance, we're working on new tools to see how can we put very clear obligations on those who are the gatekeepers, to make sure that it is actually possible also for the smaller ones to have a say and present their services and products in the marketplace. And how can we prevent markets from tipping, so that you can grow, you can get your strengths within a European single market, and because of that also compete globally. And I think we underestimate the value of having a single market. Because one of the reasons why we now have Chinese giants and US giants is that they have a single market where they can grow up and consolidate and get the strength. And here, of course, for us, it's more challenging because we have many languages, different cultures. But if we have the willingness to make sure that there is a single market, then European businesses can get the scale and the strength that it takes to compete globally.
On this very point, I have a question from Francesco, who's precisely asking what new, and I would say apart from the single market, what new regulatory tools can be envisaged for EU enforcers to safeguard competition in digital markets before market tips and structural problem occurs?
Well, that is indeed an excellent question, and we have been struggling to answer that now for quite some time. And probably we'll need two things, at least. We will need sort of ex-ante regulation to say, well, if you are a digital gatekeeper, these are the obligations that you have, end of story. And we'll also need to say, well, how can we do market investigations and look into sort of the structural way that a market functions, and correct that if we see that there is a risk of tipping, if there is sort of monopolistic strategies by players who are not yet dominant or monopolies. The inspiration to explore that comes from the UK, from the CMA, their competition authority. They have such a tool, or at least similar. So I think we need to explore these two sort of lines of working to have tools that complement one another.
Okay, but Pascal Lamy, what is your, I would say, your global perspective on reconciling sovereignty and industrial policy in the digital sectors?
Well, assuming I'm right in believing, like many others in this global conversation in recent times, that the name of the game will be more resilience, more precaution. Inevitably, this leads to a preference for local solutions, for national solutions, because this is where the tools to do that are immediately available. And this is probably what's going to happen. I've seen this morning, like others, that, for instance, Japan has just launched a specific fund subsidized by the taxpayer to reshore part of the Japanese production which takes place in China. This is an example of state-led action in order to increase resilience. Of course, seen from a global point of view, the result of all this will be a huge fragmentation. So that the reality is that increasing resilience at the local level will lead to increasing fragility at the global level. And this is absolutely key in areas like digital with infrastructures, for instance. So there is a big problem there, which I see coming. And of course, it is even more of a problem for the European Union, which is, again, somewhere in between the national and the global. And how, with this new balance between efficiency, resilience, translate into industrial policies, and at which level, is a challenge for the European Union, because I believe some member states will believe they have to do that. Germany, France. Others will believe this needs to be done at EU level. And finding the right compromise and the right balance within the European Commission, which represent the general interest of the Union, so that the right balance is set at EU level, I think is something which the Commission needs to prepare very, very, very carefully and thoroughly.
Okay. Margrethe, you'll probably want to react on that, but let me follow up with something which is related. You said, I think it was in an interview to the Financial Times last week, you said that you would not accept that because of the situation, European companies become prey for takeover by third countries group. But I'm blessed with having in front of me a competition commissioner and a former trade commissioner. So I would like to ask you whether the current EU competition and trade law respective toolkits are sufficient for the Commission to intervene efficiently and in time to enforce what you have just said. And if so, if not so, how do you plan to adapt those instruments to the situation? Margrethe Vestager, perhaps.
Well, first I'd say that I think Pascal has an excellent point. That self-sufficiency may lead to a very much more fragmented world, and that fragmentation in itself may make us more vulnerable. I think that's a very interesting dilemma. But what we have seen over decades is, for instance, that trade make us more resilient. And here also trade in the inputs we need for industry to work. We need lithium for batteries, cobalt. We need inputs that are either definitely not plenty in Europe. We may not even have anything close to sufficient access to those inputs. And since we also are great producers, for instance, of machinery, goods, financial services, of course, you need customers as well. So I think we'll have a new sort of globalization, but we'll have to figure out how to make that sort of more collaborative so that we both can achieve sort of more resilience, but that we do not trade that in for a poorer, more vulnerable world. And when it comes to making sure that we do not fall prey, because the risk is, of course, that some parts of the world will recover faster than other parts of the world. So there will be a vulnerability and the risk of a takeover. Here, of course, it is definitely not for the European level of democracy or the Commission itself. It is as much for member states who will know firsthand what is ongoing. Member states can buy a stake in a company. They're more than welcome to do that. We are neutral on ownership with market conformity. The tools of screening of foreign direct investment can be used. But I think you have a point in that we will need new tools as well. Phil Hogan, my colleague, Pascal's successor, is working on how to increase the efficiency of the trade defense tool so that it becomes a stronger tool. And I'm working with my teams on a tool to allow us to look into acquisitions by foreign state-owned company or foreign state-backed company, because Europe is open for business, but with the same rule book.
Pascal, thank you, Margrethe. Pascal?
I agree. And I think that's the right way to go. Because, again, in this world, which probably will be far more dangerous, we need to build our own capacity in these areas. And I think Margrethe has mentioned the two directions where to go. By the way, the Institut Jacques Delors Paris, Margrethe, will publish very soon, in the coming days, a brief on how should the existing system of vetting foreign direct investment, which, as you know, is a bit meager, how to reinforce it. So if you are working on that, we are ready to contribute as a think tank. More generally, I think this is the way to go, but we have to look at the global side of this, and this will probably make it more necessary to have, for instance, a stronger WTO agreement on subsidies. And we know that the existing one is weak, but with huge flow of subsidies that will inevitably distort trade. There is need for more in the times to come. And I think it's also going to be the case in an area where, although the Commission tried several times through the trade side or through the competition side to have more stringent global rules in competition, I think we will need more of that in this world where states will be competing more and supporting firms.
Thank you. A reaction, Margrethe Vestager?
I very much agree that the WTO is part of the key. And that can sound very strange because we all know the controversy around the WTO. But at the same time, we have managed to table a reform proposal with Japanese and US colleagues to the WTO. Because exactly when it comes to subsidies, of course, there are, right now, the subsidies in Europe are enormous, but also on a normal day, of course, subsidies are handed out to research, development, investment, culture, all kinds of different issues. So what we are trying to cater for is to have the very nuanced debate about harmful subsidies that unlevel the playing field, and the subsidies that comes from correcting market failures, enabling risk-taking that would otherwise not be able to take place. And I think it's very important to insist that even though it may look very difficult in multilateral forums, that we still need that on very sort of close to home right now. Of course, we need the World Health Organization to help us out, to have the knowledge and the insight needed. And that, of course, is what makes these debates so tricky, that you have the member states, you have the regional organization, and then you have the global multilaterals that is indeed needed as well to be reformed, but not to be discarded.
Thank you. After the time of crisis management and that of planning and implementing exit strategies and already is coming the time of recovery and planning recovery. And I'd like to ask Pascal Lamy, in his view, what role could the achievement of digital sovereignty play in optimizing the effectiveness of Europe's recovery plans?
Well, first, we're looking at a pot of 1 billion euros, assuming the 500 billion are for the crisis, the immediate treatment of the crisis. the order of magnitude of what heads of state and government and the Commission and the Parliament will be working with is €1 billion. In my view, this should be public money, whether direct, whether borrowed in whatever form, at least with a sort of EU balance sheet. This should lead to more conditionalities in two areas, which is environment and digital. And I think on the green side, by the way, the Brussels Institute Jacques Delors will also publish next week a big piece on how to use this recovery plan to accelerate the Green Deal. And I think it should be good. It should be also led, constructed in a way to accelerate digitalization. It's no secret that we are late. I don't think I need any expansion on this with this audience, with Margaret or with Bruno and CERRE. I think it should be an occasion to try and accelerate the proper decarbonization and digitalization of the EU economy. Short term although, and I can see that in many countries, I think there is one urgency, and this is not for the recovery plan, this is for the crisis management, which is to help startups which are in great danger of going bankrupt and support a number of firms of a higher size, which are very heavily hit. And I think on this, there should be some sort of short-term plan in the digital sector so that the Commission focuses and helps state aids in a way, state interventions, to make sure that we will not lose too much of our productive capacity. And we know that in the digital, a lot of the productive capacity lies in the brains of people who can be severely affected by this crisis.
Thank you. Margrethe, should the title of your position be modified, and should we say that it's a Europe fit for the digital age and a digital Europe fit for getting out of the crisis?
Well, I'm very happy that Pascal shares this because this is sort of this is the passion driving the work done on recovery planning here. It is to say, well, it doesn't make any sense to rebuild the old world and then make it green and then make it digital. Now we have a new baseline. We have it when it comes to green. I think every one of us who lives in Brussels appreciate the air quality that we've had for the last couple of weeks. It's quite amazing. You can really be used to being able to breathe freely. But of course, also when it comes to digital, we have worked, learned, socialized, shopped, doing sports, everything digital. So we have a new baseline. And that, of course, should be used to say, well, we will pursue our strategic goals, because these are strategic goals to make Europe what she deserves to be, green, a climate neutral continent, and to make best use of digital technology. And since we are also in part doing this recovery for lended funds, goes without saying, not possible without creating more debts, and the next generation will have to pay that back. I think there's also a certain logic or sort of internal coherence in saying, well, we should of course rebuild a modern society that will also serve and be useful for the generations to come. And here I think again that the strategic goals of green and digital is exactly what we need. And they are also great job creators. If you look at the millions and millions of buildings that need to be refitted, both digitally and climate-wise, to be more energy efficient, you see all the jobs then will be created there. When you look at the energy transformation, to invest in renewable energies, to make sure that this is also digitalized, you'd see how many jobs can be created in those sectors. And the good thing about this is that you can deliver very, very fast. Because exactly as Pascal says, well, what happens when you're unemployed is that, well, unfortunately, the first thing very often is that you lose your sort of your self-esteem, and there is a deterioration of your skills. So to get people back at work, to make sure that we make the most of the time not in work, to make that a learning situation, the better we will succeed in rebuilding in a green and digital way.
Okay, let's perhaps, because I see that unfortunately time is going forward, and I suggest we extend this because I see a lot of interest and a number of questions. I'll try to take some of them. Let's try to go until 3 o'clock at the latest, if that's okay with both of you. Okay, so let's perhaps go even more global. The EU is a political construction. It's a political construction which is based on rules. So a question to both of you, and I'll start perhaps with Pascal. When you are essentially based on rules, and when you don't have regalian functions, you don't have the capability to raise tax, you don't have a fully fledged EU budget, you don't have a common European defense, do you have the means of your ambitions regarding sovereignty? And can one realistically anticipate that the EU will ever be granted these functions without the advent of a European demos, a feeling of belonging to something which is bigger than our nation states? Pascal Lamy.
I think this is on the big question on the way to more European sovereignty, assuming this notion of sovereignty, which is extremely familiar to my compatriots, much more familiar than in many other member states, finds a sort of reincarnation under what I hear the European Commission using now, which is strategic autonomy, which probably sounds a bit better than sovereignty for Germans or for Nordic countries. I expect this. Now, to answer your question, I think regulation is both a good defensive tool. What Margaret did in competition on GAFAs and the rest is ensuring against a danger, which was monopolies. And that's a defensive. I would say that the RGPD, which Margrethe already mentioned, is both defensive of privacy, our values. It has shown, although this was not probably the intention, to become offensive, because it has led other places on this planet to converge towards this standard, which is why regulation is also a way to export norms and to increase an influence which have to do with sovereignty. Now, this leaves us with a sort of more offensive part of the sovereignty. By the way, where the EU should be very careful, in my view, is what's happening in the US, where there are new extraterritorial sanctions cooking that would allow the US government to license chip making in foreign countries when it uses whatever ingredient of US fabrication in the chips value chain. Now, this is obviously China directed, but it can be a very dangerous tool, not only for China, and let's assume China will care about this, but also for us, either directly, if this licensing is imposed on European companies, or indirectly, if we cannot source from China anymore part of our digital value chain. Now, on the offensive side, I think it's all about capacity building. It's about industrial policy, which is a word that was not in fashion when I was a trade commissioner. Time has changed, I think, personally in the right direction. It's a question of capacity, and it's a question of boosting, not so much our research part, which I think is reasonably okay, especially in AI, in quantum computing, I mean, the next generation, but in innovation. And this is, of course, something I believe is better done at EU level. So if instead of shrinking the Commission's proposal on the next European Research and Innovation Program, which was what was happening, where you needed more money for cohesion and more money for agriculture, instead of shrinking the future, we should use the next multi-financial framework to double on research and innovation support by the Commission and by the EU budget. And I think that's the best way to go in order to increase our capacity to be sovereign.
Okay. I would like to ask Margrethe Vestager. You'll probably want to react on this this issue of the demos and the Union having the means of its ambitions regarding sovereignty. But I have a question which is very specific and which illustrates, I think, the debate. It's a question which came from Wolfgang, and he's asking: U.S. legislation is preventing the export of American citizen personal data, while more than 90% of EU citizens' personal data are being stored and processed in the US, and close to 60% of cloud servers in the world are owned by large US-based platforms. In the EU, the Irish Data Protection Commissioner is in charge of scrutinizing most big tech companies with regard to data protection violation, but it has, however, so far not taken any notable actions despite an overwhelming amount of pending probes. So there is clearly, therefore, a problem of under-enforcement of GDPR. And Wolfgang asked, does you, Executive Vice President Vestager, agree with this assessment? And what do you intend to do to address the problem?
Well, actually, I don't know the answer to this question because I don't work firsthand with the enforcement of the GDPR. It is my colleagues Vera Jourova and Didier Reinders who would do that. I think it is very important that we do not necessarily think about the localization of data as the most important point, but as the access to data and how data is stored, that privacy rules are maintained, which is why we have made these decisions of equivalence over the last years after the GDPR came into effect. I don't know what is the stock of cases, but I would be happy to check and come back at some other time. What you say about a feeling of belonging, I think that is very important because places means a thing for a human, where you grew up, the landscape, sort of the food qualities, everything that sort of constitutes that you feel at home. In these days, one of the things that really makes me feel at home in Europe is the fact that we have universal access to healthcare. And I think sometimes we underestimate that we have European values that are translated into real everyday rights and benefits and obligations for the individual. Now, of course, we cannot travel, but I think if one mentally travels with the news that we hear from the US, from China, from the African continent, I think it's easy to see that we do, as Europeans, belong in a world where we have specific values, and we have made the effort to translate these values into real everyday life. So for me, the important thing in the coming months and years is to show that we take action, that we translate our insights, our data, the political willingness into actions, so that people see that we continue to do this. And this is why the recovery, the coordination, yet not harmonization in getting out of the health crisis is so important. And that we don't sort of let that skip in also important debates about governance and in institutional structures, because I think the majority of people, they see what happens in their life, what is the interrelationship between the states where they live, the country where they live, and the European Union.
Thank you. I'd like to perhaps to move slowly towards the conclusion, and I take a question which was raised by another interview that I read in the FT, and that was President Macron, who last week suggested that in their current form, globalization and multilateralism will count among the victims of the crisis. And what I would like to understand is what do you, Pascal, what do you, Margrethe, think about the fact that this could be an opportunity to reconsider the contents of sovereignty as we have been conceiving it until now? Would you agree that we must work on, from now on reconciling sovereignty, and more specifically the EU strategic autonomy, with what will remain the inescapable interdependence of our countries and our economies at global level, which clearly has been enhanced once again by the crisis? I don't know who wants to start first. Perhaps we'll leave the last word to the Executive Vice President. So Pascal.
I'm with that. First, let me say I totally agree with Margrethe on what she said about the values, what really unites us. And the problem is that, and I've seen that for the last 30 years permanently, the values that unite the Europeans are much clearer in the eye of non-Europeans than in the eye of Europeans. And when we will look back at this COVID crisis 10 or 20 years from now, it will be absolutely clear that there was a Chinese way to cope with this shock. There was a European way to cope with this shock, and there was a US way to cope with this shock. I don't know whether there would be an African way or Latin American one, but I'm sure we have differences that appear and that may lead, just in looking at how different the others are, to unite around values. Now, to your question, Macron saying to the FT, globalization and multilateralism will be victims of this crisis. I'm not worried about globalization, but I'm worried about multilateralism. I'm not worried about globalization because A, it's a process, it's not a value. I never thought globalization was a value. I know there will be some bits of deglobalization, but as I often said, and I remain of this view with all the discussions I'm having with business people, with planning staffs all over the planet, globalization was efficient and painful. Deglobalization will be inefficient and painful. So I don't mind, in a way, it's not a huge problem for me. Multilateralism is a real issue because in this tougher world, sort of more Hobbesian world, which I'm afraid we're heading to, with a US-China rivalry that has gone up and that this crisis will even increase, not least because of the capacity of Mr. Trump to antagonize, insult the rest of the world, and particularly China, who may not have, by the way, a totally clean nose, but this will be tougher. In this world, where is the catalyst, where is the champion, where is the place where some sort of new multilateralism can be figured? It's the European Union. Either the European Union becomes capable to sort of, in order to save capitalism and multilateralism, to change it, or we will be in a very difficult situation. And of course, the capacity of EU to move to a new form of multilateralism with the necessary reforms, with new devices, and many of us have plenty of ideas on how to modernize multilateralism, including as a chair of the Paris Peace Forum, whose precise purpose is to find new coalitions in order to address major global problems with NGOs, with businesses, with cities. And by the way, I'm very glad that we are very much supported by the European Commission. I think this leads us to the basic question of whether in the coming years, EU is able to increase its power, its influence, and this means further integration. So the reason I'm worried about multilateralism for many reasons, but I'm worried about Europe because I think depending on whether Europe will be able to increase its clout, we might move to plan A or plan B. And for my grandchildren, I don't like plan B.
Okay, that's clear. Margrethe Vestager.
I think it's a very interesting and thought-provoking analysis by Pascal, and I think it's very well put. That globalization is a process, not a value, but working with other people, that is a value. Also, when you work with other people where you do not immediately share your interests. And that is, of course, the main skill. Can you work with people where you do not immediately have the same interests, that you have opposing interests, that it takes an effort from you? And the thing is that no matter how we think about this, we still live on the same planet. And climate change, no region, no country, it is for everyone. So we'll have to figure out how, on the one hand side, to be more resilient in each region, while at the same time cooperating closely on matters that have a global, a planetary magnitude. And this is why I'm so happy with this kind of debates. I've been looking very much forward to the papers that Pascal mentioned by the Delors Institute. I think it is so important that we have the conversations, the dialogues, the insightful papers to guide us, because obviously this is a process full of dilemmas and things that may seem strange and contradicting in the beginning. As you say, things that are not black or white, but that doesn't mean that they're gray. That means that they are indeed colorful, and we should enjoy it instead of fear it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for what is a very positive conclusion. We have, unfortunately, to conclude here, what I hope will have been for you viewers an inspiring moment. We have still, I think, another 20 or 30 questions which were addressed to us. Clearly, digital sovereignty is bound to remain in good position on the political agenda of the EU. I can tell you that we at CERRE, we're definitely going to investigate that topic, not least because it has much more complex dimensions and implications that, as we've seen in our discussion, it may look like at first sight. So I'd like to thank wholeheartedly our two great panelists, Margrethe Vestager and Pascal Lamy, for their terrific contribution. I'd like also to say a big thanks to the great CERRE team, and in particular to Lauriane Gillet, who has organized this event. Thank you also to all of you, our viewers who have been watching us. I understand that you make a very large number this afternoon. The video of this conversation will be available on the CERRE site and on our YouTube channel. And if you want to be kept informed about CERRE activities and read our last publication, you just need to do one thing: visit our web site and register there to your newsletter. And I think I can conclude here. Bye-bye, see you again soon. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself and of your loved ones. Bye.
Bye, thank you.